Their lead singer once headbutted Tom Arya of Slayer. They recorded a coffin and a chainsaw for their records, and they invented an entirely new genre of heavy metal. So dangerous that churches would be burnt down and people would even die. They helped to bridge the gap between heavy metal and Satanism and scared the hell out of people in doing so. Although groups such as Motorhead and the new wave of British heavy metal movement would help to introduce audiences to heavier and more aggressive styles of music, I don't think anyone was even remotely prepared for this new dark and satanic musical allegiance to rise from the underground. It inspired the entire thrash metal movement that developed throughout the 1980s and helped to give birth to the Big Four: Metallica, Slayer, Anthrax, and Megadeth. This is black metal, the story of Venom. During the 16th century, a so-called vampire-like serial killer would strike fear into the hearts of local Hungarian civilians. Countess Elizabeth Bathory of Ecsed, or the Blood Countess, lived from 1560 to 1641, and stories of her brutal escapades became part of Hungarian folklore. She was a noble woman from the House of Bathory, a powerful Hungarian noble family founded in the 13th century, with real-life links to Transylvania, the birthplace of Dracula. Legend has it that the Bathory family even stood by Vlad the Impaler during the Battle of Valia Alba in 1476. The name Bathory will most likely be familiar to some thanks to the Swedish extreme metal band of the same name formed by Quorthon in 1983. Countess Bathory is said to have tortured and killed local peasants for years. It has been claimed that she was the most prolific female serial killer of all time, having slain more than 600 young women and girls inside her lavish castles. But why? Well, she believed that bathing in the blood of virgins would grant her eternal youth. So what better topic to write about for a black metal band? And that is exactly what Venom did. Countess Bathory would be released on their 1982 record Black Metal, an album that is said to have started the first wave of the black metal genre.
Open the door, enter hell's door, black dog in the night, beating fast on my brain, fading the light till it falls in hell. All I love is virgins, shit, these silent meals.
The song even appears to have inspired grunge music as well, to a certain extent, because no doubt you can hear the similarities between these two songs. Venom are now widely accepted as the originators of the black metal genre. They have inspired countless musicians to follow in their footsteps, such as Slayer, Mayhem, Metallica, and Megadeth. Hell, you could even argue that Venom influenced the entire Bay Area thrash metal scene that developed during the 1980s. I think there are a few historians who would probably argue whether Venom were really part of the new wave of British heavy metal or not, but I feel they should be part of it simply because Venom was sort of a laughingstock, and I just think that they've never been given the credit that they deserve. They put Welcome to Hell out in 1981, and they've influenced, I think, that whole thrash movement, which basically started with Slayer, and I just think Venom were never really given enough credit for what they started. But if Venom invented black metal, then what came before it, and how did they come to be the pioneers of this dark and often dangerous subgenre of heavy metal? It's no secret that black metal has resulted in the literal death of people within its community. And what did happen with Tom Arya of Slayer? Venom would release their first tape in 1980. The cassette would be called Demon and featured 3 songs: Angel Dust, Raise the Dead, and Red Light Fever. Jeff Mantas Dunn on guitar, Conrad Cronos Lant on bass, Tony Abaddon Bray on drums, and the vocalist would be Clive Jesus Christ Archer. They even tried to get a record deal off the back of this tape, and the response was, well, not very friendly. When we made our first demos, I sent them off to every record company, and I got a letter back from EMI where all it said was, fuck off. Of course, before this, we had Black Sabbath, who invented heavy metal, punk, and Motorhead. Venom essentially took all three of these elements and tried to create something with a slightly more aggressive but heavier edge to it. We were the band that was influenced by Motorhead and the Sex Pistols, but we took their sound and made something completely new out of it. We were completely new. No one had heard anything like us. And of course, unbeknown to us, in America, there were these kids who were listening to our records and then shaping what we were doing into their own thing. Slayer would be an example of that. And I agree, without us, those bands either wouldn't exist or would sound very different from the way they do. By the time Venom had released their first cassette, Demon, Sex Pistols had released Never Mind the Bollocks in 1977, and Motorhead had already helped to define a new sound. Their debut released also in 1977, Bomber in 1979, and of course Overkill in the same year were all standout albums that helped to fuse a heavier sound with a more punk edge. But as we all know, Motorhead play rock and roll. Venom, though, added the addition of Satanism and the occult into their music and imagery, which, of course, had already been done by groups such as Black Sabbath and American hard rock outfit Coven. However, combine this with Venom's sound and you had a completely different beast altogether. I started listening to rock music from a very young age, as I lived beside bands like The Who and the Rolling Stones in London during the 1960s. I'd say the music that gave me the biggest awakening that I could really identify with was punk rock in the 1970s. The musicians were of my generation, and I totally understood their attitude. To me, punk rock reflected a lot of the feelings that people of my age group had at the time. So I think being influenced by both rock and punk gave me the ingredients to create black, thrash, speed, death, and power metal. Conrad Lant, or Cronos as most know him as, was born in 1963 in London, England. Music was a staple in his life as a youngster, and he found himself in bands from an early age. He even worked in a recording studio after leaving school, and this is one of the songs he was an engineer on, a punk band called Disorder. Getting expelled was pretty normal, but at my school, one of the sports we used to do was pugilism. We used to beat the shit out of each other as part of the curriculum. You learn to stand up for yourself, and I think that's something I carried into Venom with the attitude, if you don't like it, fuck you. And of course, growing up in the 60s and 70s, Cronos would have been exposed to all the usual musical suspects at the time. I've always been, from being young, a fan of what you'd call rock music. From the Beatles to the Rolling Stones to The Who, through Led Zeppelin and Deep Purple and everybody. So I've always liked the idea of drums, guitar, this, that, and the other. My mum's brother used to play guitar in a country western band, so I've always been around instruments and music. I've never really gotten into any of the electronic stuff when it came along in the 80s. I didn't really see how that was working for me in any way. I just like a drum kit and a guitar. Cronos would meet Jeffrey Dunn, otherwise known as Mantas, in the 70s and decided to form Venom after playing in a couple of other bands. They decided to include themes and lyrics about Satan from the beginning, which couldn't be more obvious from their debut record, Welcome to Hell, released in 1981. Cronos was now the vocalist, and this debut record offered songs such as Sons of Satan, Witching Hour, In League with Satan, and of course, Welcome to Hell, along with a satanic sigil of a pentagram and Baphomet as your album cover. Well, it doesn't get any more satanic than that. Those early Sabbath albums really did something to me, but really, Status Quo was the first band where I thought, I can properly relate to this. I loved all the denim and the hair, and the way they played. Heads down. When I was 11, Quo did 6 nights at Newcastle City Hall, and I saw every show. Status Quo really wasn't an influence I was expecting to discover when delving into the world of Venom, but they were one of the biggest rock bands in the UK and saw enormous success during the 1970s and 1980s. When Welcome to Hell was released, the musical landscape was tame, to say the least. Apart from the punk movement and Motorhead, it wasn't exactly all hail Satan on the radio stations every day. The UK album charts were being dominated by the likes of Adam and the Ants, Dire Straits, and Spandau Ballet. Not an upside-down crucifix in sight. And of course, you could expect to see AC/DC, REO Speedwagon, and Queen in there as well. In October of 1980, though, a year before the release of Welcome to Hell, one of the most influential rock and roll albums of all time would grace the world with its cowboy and western style aggression. Ace of Spades by the mighty Motorhead would reach number 4 in the UK album charts. Whilst this is arguably the most iconic Motorhead record, this wasn't their first chart entry. Their debut record in 1977, Overkill in 1979, and Bomber, released in 1979 as well, had all seen commercial success in the UK charts. Many argue that this success in Motorhead, being able to break through that commercial barrier with these records, essentially helped to open the doors wide open for heavy and more extreme music to thrive during the 80s. So when Welcome to Hell was released in 1981, that heavy sound set by Black Sabbath and Deep Purple had already been chewed up and turned up to 11 by Motorhead and Lemmy's thundering bass. And I would argue that you could even hear the influence of Motorhead in Venom's first cassette tape, Demon. We also can't forget the influence of Judas Priest here. Priest had released 6 studio albums between 74 and 1980, with the latter being the year they released British Steel. A record that not only hit number 4 in the UK chart, but also number 34 in the US Billboard charts. Whilst they weren't exactly singing about Satan, they certainly looked as if they should have been. And I can't help but wonder how much of their stage attire influenced that of Venom's stage outfits. Venom, though, actively wanted to use the concept of Satanism to try and shock people and entertain people. Of course, the general public would deem them as a group of Satanists, but to the boys in Venom, it was more about putting on a show. Welcome to Hell also crossed that bridge between heavy metal and full-blown Satanism. I always wanted to carry the Aussie thing to the nth degree. I was always reading up on Satanism and demonology and witchcraft. I went out with a girl who was in a witch coven, and that sparked something in me. I loved Sabbath, but I realized that they'd only touched the tip of the iceberg. This could go so far. Ozzy was singing about being chased by the devil. I thought, I'll be the devil. Black Sabbath, of course, used occultist themes in their imagery and some songs and lyrics, but you could argue that it was pretty mild compared to Welcome to Hell. I was always frustrated with Ozzy because he would always go, oh, there's a demon over there, he's coming to get me, God help me. And you'd think, what the fuck? Even now when he stands there going, I'm the Prince of Darkness, when did you become the Prince of Darkness? That's happened in the last 10 years. You were never the Prince of Darkness, you were a drunk. Ozzy, we love you, but you're not satanic in the slightest. You stand there with a crucifix, singing about the black arts, but you're not singing about it as if you're one of them. So I was always a bit peeved with them. I am the devil. I am in league with Satan. I am going to come and bite you on the ass, Ozzy. And then we have the band members themselves. They used skulls, spikes, and chains in promo pictures. They essentially looked like satanic warriors coming from a faraway land to eat your children. Venom were the real deal. Whether they worshipped him or not, they were publicly embracing Satan within their music. Whilst Welcome to Hell didn't smash any sales records, it did go global. Originally released in the UK and Italy in 1981, it would then be released in Japan and France in 1982 and 1983 respectively, before hitting the shelves in Canada in 1984 and then the US in 85. The US release would be facilitated by Combat Records. Combat, of course, would be the same label to release Don't Break the Oath by Merciful Fate in 1984 and Hell Awaits by Slayer in 1985. But we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves because before this, we had black metal. This is arguably one of the most important records in the history of heavy metal music. Black Metal, released by Venom in 1982. This is considered to be the very first black metal record to ever be released, and also the catalyst to spawn an entirely new genre of extreme music. What makes it even cooler is the record starts with a song called Black Metal, and the intro for this is the sound of metal being cut. This was not a sound effect created by fancy Pro Tools software or an analog synthesizer. Venom actually took a chainsaw into the studio along with some steel and physically recorded themselves chainsawing through the steel. It doesn't get more metal than that. We got some huge big pieces of steel and put them in vices and actually brought the chainsaw into the studio. We wrecked all the plates on the chainsaw doing so. On the actual album version, we cut it in a way that as soon as the needle touched the actual vinyl, crack, it went straight into that racket. So straight away for the uninitiated, you get that sense of panic. We created that from the word go. We wanted people to go, what's going on? We wanted to create something that sounded fucked. Everyone else is striving for perfection and trying to get everything right. But we wanted to go the other way and create panic. This record essentially opened up the gates of hell for extreme metal music. Combined with Venom's overall presence and debut record Welcome to Hell the previous year, this is the reason thrash metal developed in the first place. Slayer, Metallica, Megadeth, and Anthrax, the big four of thrash, would probably still exist thanks to Motorhead, punk, and the new wave of British heavy metal movement, but would they have been as aggressive? And then we have groups such as Mayhem from Norway, who became the faces of the second wave of black metal during the late 80s and early 90s. I think we were a catalyst. Metal needed a kick up the ass, and we came along and gave people permission to try new stuff. I just wanted to be part of the story of rock and roll. If anything, I helped keep music alive. Mayhem formed in 1984 and supposedly took their name from a Venom song. That song being Mayhem with Mercy, taken from their 81 record Welcome to Hell. Which is an interesting choice because the song itself doesn't exactly scream black metal. It's a very chilled instrumental. In 1987, Mayhem would release their first EP called Death Crush, which even featured a cover of Venom's song Witching Hour, taken from Welcome to Hell. And it's pretty easy to imagine that a band like Mayhem would have seen Welcome to Hell as the first black metal record, as opposed to the black metal record itself. Of course, many people to this day still argue the fact that Venom's first two records didn't really sound the same as Scandinavian black metal outfits such as Bathory or Mayhem. But you could argue that with Black Sabbath. Go back and listen to their debut self-titled record from 1970. It certainly doesn't sound like what heavy metal developed into, yet is still classed as the first heavy metal record. The point is, Venom were the first group to combine elements of punk, Black Sabbath, and Motorhead from a musical perspective, shape it into something more aggressive, and then add Satanism into the mix, along with the visual aspects of wearing spikes, leather, and chains on stage. So you could easily argue that Welcome to Hell could be classed as the first black metal record. Others will tell you that Bathory's debut album released in 1984 is the first true black metal record, but I'll let you fight that one out in the comments section. In an interview with Metal Hammer, Cronos himself was even asked what he thought about this entire argument, and he said the following: "It was so dark and so evil, it was the next generation, but it also created what I call the black metal police. All these people going, this band is black metal, this band isn't. And I love this one, Venom aren't black metal. I just wish they'd come up with their own term like Norse metal. That's what I say to these guys, you've stolen my term, but you're not really black metal, because black metal is power metal, speed metal, thrash metal, death metal, all the metals together. So call it whatever you want. The fact remains, no other band was doing what Venom were doing, and there are no other albums from 1981 or 1982 that could challenge Welcome to Hell or black metal. By the 1980s, even Black Sabbath was starting to sound more like a hard rock group as opposed to the spooky and doomy-esque sound they first developed with their debut in 1970. They even had a new vocalist, the late great Ronnie James Dio, who replaced Ozzy after he was kicked out in 1979. Two notable Black Sabbath albums to represent this point would be Heaven and Hell, released in 1980, and Mob Rules in 1981.
Oh, they say that it's over. Feel myself with tears to cry. I can't accept, but I quit inside you. You've been running near the circle.
And as you can hear, they are miles apart from what Venom was doing at the time. Between 1981 and 1987, Venom would release 5 studio albums, which what most fans would call the classic lineup. Those albums were Welcome to Hell in 1981, Black Metal in 1982, At War with Satan in 1984, Possessed in 1985, and Calm Before the Storm in 1987. However, due to conflicts within the band, Cronos had quit Venom after their 87 record and decided to go solo. He formed his own group with a super original name, calling this project Cronos. He would release 2 studio albums with this project, Dancing in the Fire in 1990 and Rock and Roll Disease in 1991, before returning to Venom in 1995. Venom did continue during this time period with a different singer and released 3 more studio albums under the Venom name. Primeval in 1989, Temples of Ice in 1991, and The Wastelands in 1992. But if you ask me, releasing a Venom record without Cronos is just as blasphemous as releasing a Motorhead record without Lemmy. Although the classic lineup did reunite to release Cast in Stone in 1997, the 9th Venom studio album, it didn't last long.
He is so strong, reciting atmospheres to tangle Temptation!
More conflicts and fighting within the band would see Cast in Stone being the last time the classic lineup would release a Venom record together. And speaking of fighting, there has long since been a rumor, or I guess you could say a mistold story, going around about an altercation between Cronos and Slayer's frontman Tom Arya. We all know the Slayer story, pioneers of thrash, influenced by Motorhead and Venom, and became one of the big 4 of thrash. Stories about what really happened had been circulating the internet for some time. Some say Tom Arya took a piss in Cronos' mouth, others say Cronos just didn't like Tom and decided to punch him. And some parts of this are true, but slightly inaccurate. The now infamous event took place in 1985 when Slayer and Venom were actually touring together. And the event did indeed include pee and violence. Here is what really happened. That story has been twisted so many ways. I've heard Tom Arya stuck his dick in the guitarist's mouth, and Tom Arya tried to fuck the bus driver's ear. Here's the truth. A gig got cancelled, so we let Slayer stay on our tour bus as they had nowhere to sleep. Then Tom got really drunk and pissed himself. I got annoyed, so I headbutted him and knocked the guy out. The next morning he came in with a black eye and was all apologetic. Sorry, I was out of order. I said, not a problem, man, it's metal. The tour in question was the 1985 Combat Tour with Venom, Slayer and Exodus on the same bill, all of whom were signed to Combat Records at the time. And to be honest, if you know anything about what used to happen in the 1980s with bands on tour, this was actually pretty tame. There are only a handful of bands on Earth that can lay claim to changing and shaping the face of music. Venom are one of those bands. They will forever leave a legacy that is unmatched and should be revered as one of the most legendary heavy metal groups to have ever existed. Cronos himself was once asked how he'd want to be remembered, so I'll leave you with that. As somebody who took chances as an artist and a musician, somebody who broke the mold, I want people in the future to think that band Venom was crazy and look at the influence on all the stuff that came after them. That's where I see my place as a part of the whole big picture.